So lesson 4.6 is on complex numbers. And so as we look, we kind of talked about this a little bit before when we took the square root of a negative, how it came out as a imaginary number or no root is what it would say. And I talked about how, eventually we're going to talk about imaginary numbers or the complex number system. And that's what we're going to do right now. So in this unit, you're going to learn what the imaginary unit I is. You're going to learn how to add and subtract complex numbers, and you're going to learn how to multiply complex numbers, as well as simplify radicals when you have an I involved. So not all quadratic equations have real number solutions. And we talked about how when you graph, when we did the whole idea of graphing and we couldn't factor, we talked about how sometimes when you factor, your u's above the x-axis, which means there's no roots or no zeros, or if it was below the x-axis, there was no roots or zeros. And we talked about how that may play out when we start solving quadratic equations, which is what we're going to do right now. So in this case, when I talk about I, we're talking about this situation where if I have a quadratic, it doesn't cross the x-axis, which is our key point. So the main thing here we want to remember or learn is that when you have the square root of a negative number, then we get an I. And so I is equal to the square root of -1 every single time. So if I have -1 underneath the square root sign, then that's the same thing as an I. And I squared is equal to -1. So some things that we need to make sure that we are aware of. And I is representing imaginary numbers. So if I was looking at the in the complex number system, if I was looking at a coordinate plane, the x-axis is our real numbers, and our y-axis is our complex or our imaginary. I guess I could say imaginary. And together, they make a complex number. And a complex number looks like this. So the general form of a complex number is a plus bi, where a is the real part, and this is our imaginary part. And you would graph that normal just as if it was a point. So with all of that in mind, that's how we're going to move on with this section. So it talks about how if you're taking the square root of a negative number, then this is really the same thing as -1 times r. And so the I comes out and we get I root r. Or if I'm taking the square root of -3, because of the negative sign, that's our I, and the 3 just stays underneath the radical. If you're taking the square root, or you're squaring, I should say, I root 2, then the I, this would be I squared, and then root 2 squared, or that's not a 2, that's an r, root r squared. And the I squared is the same thing as -1, and this, if I square the square root, we're left with what's underneath, and so that's how they're getting -r. So I root 3 squared would be I squared, and then 3, because square root of 3 squared is just 3. I squared is -1 times 3, which is -3. So as we look at example 1, they're talking about the same thing. We're taking the square root of -25. So really, this is the same thing as going negative, so I'll do it. This is like -1 times 25. So I'll go underneath the radical. So this is -1 and 25, and then 25 will break down to be 5 times 5. And again, the number that sits on the shelf is really a 2. And so we're looking for 2 of a kind. So 2 things happen. This -1, this is the same thing as an I. And then this is a pair of 5s. And so my answer ends up being a pair of 5s comes out. And because of the -1, an I comes out. So when I look at square root of -72, again, you break that down how you choose to break it down. You can go 2 times 36. You can do 8 times 9. you do whatever you want to. So I'm going to go -1 and 72, because the -1, I always want to make sure it's there. And then 72, you can look at your list if you need to. I'm going to go 2 and 36, and then 36 is 6 and 6. And I did that so that I can find my pair easy. So we remember, when you break it down, you can cross it off. And then as we look at our pairs again, there's a 2 sitting on the shelf. So this -1 is the same thing as an I. And then you're looking for pairs, and I have a pair of 6s. Now, if you broke that down to be 2 and 3, 2 and 3, and I pair it up, I'm still going to get 6 in the long run. If I can find a pair that's bigger, it makes my life easier. So I'm going to take a 6 out. I'm going to take an I out, and there's this little 2 left over. So he's going to stay back underneath. And so this is my answer. And then our last one, we've got the -5 that's already out there, which is going to stay there. Actually, we'll just leave it for a minute. We're going to take the square root of the -9, which is going to be -1 times 9. And then this is 3 times 3. And then we're looking for a pair just like before. So as we look at this, we should be noticing that this -1 makes an I, and this pair of 3s is going to come out. So this already has a -5 on the outside. So that's this guy. And then you have a pair of 3s comes out, and then you have the I. And so when you simplify, this will be -15I. And this is our answer. So again, notice how we just simplify. So go ahead and pause the video for a minute and check, or try to do problems 1 through 4, and then come back and see if you're correct. So as you look at number 1, the same idea, we should have got 2I, because this is -1 and 4, and then 4 breaks down to be 2 and 2. So the -1 is your I, and then your pair. So this is your I, and then this is your pair. So this would be 2I. -12 will break down to be -1 and 12, 3 and 4. 4 breaks down to be 2 and 2. And same idea. This -1 is the same thing as an I, and you have a pair of 2s. So this will be 2I, 3's left over, √3. The next one, you've got -36. So this is -1 times 36. 36 breaks down to be 6 and 6. And then as you look at this one, remember that there's a -1 sitting out in front. So this -1 comes out. A pair of 6s comes out. And this -1 is the same thing as an I. And so this is the same thing as -6I. And then 2 -54. This is going to be -1 and 54. 54 breaks down to be 6 and 9. 9 breaks down to be 3 and 3. 6 breaks down to be 2 and 3. And so as you're looking, again, this -1 is your I. You have a pair of 3s, and there's already 2 out there. So this is going to be 2 times 3 times I. And then there's 2 and 3s left over. So that makes the 6. And so we get 6I √6. All right, that's good for, we'll do that. That's good for video 1.